This lecture will discuss the texts of the Old Testament and the textual criticism of the Old Testament. Well, just what is the Old Testament? Well, you can look at an English Bible and you'll see the first part of it will be labeled the Old Testament. Where did that come from? Well, the English represents a translation of the Hebrew and Aramaic Bible. The Standard Scholarly Edition of the Hebrew Bible comes from a manuscript called B19A, and the Standard Scholarly Edition, called Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia, will include variants in the margin where there are readings that would be different than what is in that text. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been an influence too. When they were discovered, they represented copies of the Hebrew Bible about 1,000 years older than had been previously known. The text that is translated in our English Bibles tends to be what is called the Masoretic text. Masoretic texts, which came to be developed in the years AD 500 to 900 by Jewish scribes known as Masorets. The Masoretic text is the basic text of the Hebrew Bible, the basis of almost all modern translations. And again, B19A is the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible, dating to AD 1008. Another important manuscript is the Aleppo Codex, which dates to 925, but is not a complete copy of the Hebrew Bible. And what's interesting is that there are very few variations in the Masoretic manuscripts, a testimony of how carefully the Masorets preserved the text. The work of the Masorets. Among the things that the Masorets did was that they copied the Hebrew text. They were the scribes that produced new copies. You didn't have printing presses, so you had to do it by hand, and the Masorets did that. They created a standardized system of pronunciation. Originally, the Hebrew Bible was written with consonants without vowels, or there were certain consonants that would indicate vowels, but by and large the vowels were absent. But the Masorets added vowels so that a reader could easily pronounce what was there. They also created a series of marginal notes known as the Masorets, and these marginal notes were intended on helping the scribe preserve the text without any variation. Some of these were counting aids. For example, they'd mark the middle verse of a book of the Bible. And they would also count how many verses there were in a book of the Bible. So a scribe could go back after finishing a manuscript and count all the verses to see if he has the right number, and count the verses before and after the middle verse to see if it is in fact in the middle. And there'd be counts of particular forms of words, especially less common forms, as an aid of checking manuscripts. Another thing that they would include is what is called Kurei Kativ. Kativ is what is written, Kurei is what is read. And at times the Masorets would tell the reader, don't read what you see before your eyes, what is written. Rather, read what is in the margin of the text, what's called the Kurei, and that's the reading that they intend for you to actually use. Now, why would there be a variant reading? Well, sometimes they seem to have preserved two different versions of a verse, of a text. For example, in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 3, in the Hebrew Bible it's chapter 9 and verse 2, there's a word lo, which, depending on how you spell it, either means not, or to it, or to him. And the Masoretic text in the Kettiv, what is written, the text reads something like, in English, you will multiply the nation and you will not increase gladness. But they say read it in the margin with a different spelling of the word not, pronounced lo. You will multiply the nation, for them you will increase gladness. And the difference, well, one is spelled in a slightly different way than the other, but it would have a different meaning depending on how you spell it. And the Masoretes perhaps perceived that the received form, which reads not, didn't make sense, and so they suggested that another reading of that form, meaning to it, to the nation, would make more sense. Or perhaps they even had two readings of that particular verse, and rather than eliminate them both, or choose one and reject the other, they preserve both. Another thing that Kare Kettiv does, it sometimes updates archaic forms. It sometimes avoids offensive language. So, for example, in Isaiah 13:16, the Kettiv says something like, their wives will be raped or ravished. The root is shakal, but the Kare in the margin softens this to their wives will be lain with, as opposed to stating explicitly what that means. Another thing that the Masoretes did was, and this is what's called a perpetual Kare, that you are not to read God's personal name, Yahweh, in Jewish tradition. And so even though the received text said Yahweh, the Masoretes always vocalize that divine name, Yahweh, which would be Yod-He Vav-He in Hebrew, or YHWH in English script. They would put the vowels of an entirely different word, Adonai, which means Lord, under the consonants of Yahweh, as a way of indicating to the reader that you should read it as Adonai Lord, and not say the divine name Yahweh. There were different schools of Masoretes. Historically, we know that there were Tiberian, Palestinian, and Babylonian schools. But the Tiberian school won out to the exclusion of the other two. Now, we do have a few manuscripts that have Palestinian and Babylonian vocalizations, but the vast majority of texts of the Hebrew Bible are following the Tiberian vocalization and the Tiberian Masorah, and it was the predominant tradition. In the Tiberian school, there were two subgroups. There was the Ben Asher tradition, and there was the Ben Naphtali tradition or school. And in Jewish circles, the Ben Asher tradition was considered the best tradition. Now, from our perspective, there's not 2 cents worth of difference between Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali readings, but at least in Jewish tradition, the Ben Asher school was considered the better. Now, how accurately did the Masoretes preserve the text that they received? And the answer is remarkably accurately. As a matter of fact, they preserved the Hebrew Bible better than the New Testament scribes preserved the Greek New Testament. Indeed, this was proven by Kennicott and DeRossi, who studied manuscripts in the 1770s, in the early days of the science of textual criticism. What Kennicott and DeRossi did was that they went through the manuscripts that were known in their days and started listing variations. And they were surprised to find how few variants there really were. And they concluded that the Masoretic tradition represented really only one school of manuscripts. Now, if you're familiar with New Testament textual criticism, you would know that there are several schools: the Alexandrian school, the Western texts, the Byzantine tradition. But you don't get that kind of thing among Masoretic texts, manuscripts. They are all pretty much the same tradition. We will talk about prominent exemplars of the Hebrew Masoretic texts in the next session.